Live now to a debate between third-party presidential candidates. You can see the candidates are on the stage there. Chuck Baldwin is the Constitution Party's nominee, and Ralph Nader is an independent. On your screen now is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges. He's the moderator. Live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
10 minutes, and then the final closing part of the debate will see each candidate issue or give us a 2-minute closing statement. I would like to thank independent presidential candidate Ralph Nader and Chuck Baldwin from the Constitution Party for agreeing to participate in this debate. Free and equal elections, you can see their website, freeandequalelections.org, that organized the debate. C-SPAN 2, proof that television in capable hands can promote democracy and the common good, and the staff of the Mayflower Hotel for providing us with this space in which to carry out the debate. So, Mr. Baldwin, why don't you start with your 2-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for showing up to this debate. Thank you, Ralph. It's great to be here on stage with you. I'm Chuck Baldwin. I'm the candidate for President of the United States on the Constitution Party ticket. The Constitution Party is the third largest political party in America in terms of voter registration, except for the two major parties, of course, the Republicans and Democrats. We are a party that believes very much in the Constitution of the United States. That's why we are named the Constitution Party. We believe that most of the ills that we face as a country today are because the two major parties and the candidates that represent them have failed to be faithful to the principles and tenets of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. We believe that the only way that we're going to restore the greatness of America, not to mention prosperity and freedom, is to restore constitutional government. When any office holder, president, senator, congressman, county commissioner, state legislator, takes the oath of office, they raise a hand to heaven, another hand placed on the Bible, and they promise to be faithful to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the promise they make to the American people. Unfortunately, for too long, the two major parties have ignored that oath and have violated the principles of the Constitution, and that is why we're in the mess that we're in for the most part. We believe in limited government according to the constraints of the Constitution. We are a 100% pro-life party. We believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. We are pro-Second Amendment. We believe in state sovereignty. We believe that we must secure our borders. As Ronald Reagan said, a nation without borders is not a nation. We believe that only by a declaration of war can a president send troops to invade and occupy a foreign country.
I'm going to have to stop you right there. Thank you very much. Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Mr. Hedges, Mr. Baldwin, and thank the audience and C-SPAN and other television channels who are here tonight. The Constitution starts with "We the people" in its preamble. The word corporation does not exist in our Constitution. The words political party do not exist in our Constitution, and yet we're ruled by the concentration of ever larger multinational corporations and their political indentured servants in Washington and state capitals. Whenever there is a concentration of wealth and power in a society, the prospect of any kind of democratic processes and democratic produced results for the betterment of the people become very slim indeed. Justice Louis Brandeis said you can have the concentration of wealth in a few hands or you can have a democracy, but you cannot have both. Our country today is in deep trouble. 9 out of 10 Americans in a recent poll think America is in decline. 3 out of 4 Americans believe corporations have too much power over their lives. And 6 out of 10 believe both major parties are failing. We need a third political force, and we believe the Nader-Gonzalez campaign has majoritarian positions on full Medicare for all, with free choice of doctor and hospital and private delivery. We want living wage for 1 out of every 3 American workers make Walmart wages, 7, 8, 9, 10, under $11 an hour. We want to cut the bloated, wasteful military budget, remove taxpayer subsidies for corporations, such as that grotesque $700 billion bailout on Wall Street. And we want to provide more facilities for consumers, taxpayers, and voters to band together so they shift the power from the few, where it is now, to the many.
Thank you very much. The first question I'm going to ask both of you, both Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, two people who have traditionally been very wary of the two-party system, have each announced that they will vote for Barack Obama. And I'd like to read briefly why these writers, who have been fierce social critics, have taken this position, and ask you to respond to their argument. First, Howard Zinn said, "We have gone through an insufferable 8 years with the Bush administration, probably the worst administration in history. In this situation, we are desperate for a change. So even though Obama doesn't represent any fundamental change, he creates an opening for a possibility of change. That is why I am voting for Obama. That is why I suggest to people that they vote for him. But I also suggest that Obama will not be faithful, will not fulfill that potential for change unless he is enveloped by a social movement which is angry enough, powerful enough, insistent enough that he fills his abstract phrases about change with some real content." Noam Chomsky said, talking about Senator McCain and Senator Obama, "To say it doesn't make any difference who wins is to express your contempt for the general population, because it does make a difference. A lot of what they say is correct. The two parties are effectively factions of one party, the business party, but the factions are somewhat different, and over time the differences show up in benefits, working conditions, wages, things that really matter to people." So let's start with you, Mr. Nader. 90 seconds, if you could respond to these statements by Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Zinn.
Well, first of all, we know that Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Zinn agree far more with the Nader-Gonzalez campaign, but they are demonstrating a tactical vote. The tactical vote for the least worst, namely Obama, should involve a moral imperative to make demands on Obama. So if he wins with a specific mandates, specific series of mandates. The problem with the liberal and progressive intelligentsia is that they don't make their vote hard to get, and they allow the least worst to ignore them and go more to the corporate side and try to get a little slice of the right-wing vote, which is exactly what Dukakis, Mondale, Gore, and Clinton and Kerry did. And it wasn't exactly a winning strategy, except for Clinton with the Perot situation. So I think, one, there needs to be a demands made on Obama, and people living in slam dunk states that are slam dunk McCain and Obama can cast a vote for their conscience, because that doesn't affect the least worst outcome. And finally, it's not who wins, it's how they win. Are they going to win without worrying about progressive forces? Because progressive forces have told them they can be taken for granted because the McCain alternative is too horrible to contemplate.
Mr. Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think this whole mantra of the wasted vote or the lesser two evils is what has brought us to this place. I'll tell you what a wasted vote is. A wasted vote is to vote for someone that you know in your heart will not be faithful to the principles and the values that you believe in, that you know will betray the things that are core to that which is central to our nation's success, and yet to ignore those central core issues and to vote for someone because they may happen to fit into that lesser of two evils category. A wasted vote in 2008 for my conservative friends out there that are watching tonight, I would counter by saying that a wasted vote in 2008 is a vote for John McCain, because I don't believe that John McCain can anymore win this election than Bob Dole could win the election that he fought with Bill Clinton. I really believe that if Christians and evangelicals and conservatives in 2008, if they want to waste a vote, they'll vote for John McCain. I believe if they want to cast a principled vote, a vote for someone that they know in their heart will be faithful to the principles and the values that they profess to believe, I believe that they must cast a vote for Chuck Baldwin and the Constitution Party in 2008. I just believe that this whole wasted vote mentality is something that is not consistent with the principles of our founding fathers.
Thank you.
And our American Republic.
Thank you. We will now have a 5-minute discussion, and you're certainly free to ask questions of each other. I think I would begin by asking whether it's realistic, given the climate of our country, to even mount a third-party challenge, given the innumerable obstacles placed in front of candidates by the two-party system. Do you want to begin, Mr. Nader?
Oh, of course it is. I mean, look at the Liberty Party in 1840, anti-slavery. Aren't we glad some voters spun off from the Whigs and the Democrats and didn't go least worst and voted for the Liberty Party? The same for Women's Suffrage Party. The same for the Labor and Farmer parties, the late 19th and early 20th century. All these small parties never won a national election, but they put on the public table the social justice movements first, before the two major parties decided to pick them up. And aren't we glad that that occurred? You see, if nature doesn't allow seeds to sprout, it can't regenerate itself. If business doesn't allow entrepreneurs to have a chance, it can't regenerate itself. But somehow we got a shared monopoly by the Republican Democratic parties, who for a variety of state ballot access obstacles can squeeze out or drain third-party or independent candidates. They keep them off the debates because they control the debate commission. It's a private company, the two major parties. And when that happens, you don't get polled, and if you don't get polled, you don't get any time on the national TV. So it's a catch-22 vicious circle that is a suppression of the First Amendment rights of candidates that are not two-party, major party candidates to engage in the electoral arena.
All right, let's get Mr. Baldwin.
Well, the Republican Party was a minor party in 1860, and of course, we don't hear too much from the Whigs these days.
1860.
So, what did I say?
1960.
1860, that's right. So obviously, we can see that parties evolve through time. The fact of the matter is that the American people today, I believe, recognize that the two major parties and the two-party system in general is broken. A recent Fox News survey suggested that nearly 50% of the American people would consider voting for a third-party candidate in 2008. I was in Michigan not too many weeks ago, and I understand that the same survey was taken there. And in that state that has become so depressed because of NAFTA and some of these other so-called free trade deals that have destroyed our jobs and our manufacturing in those industrial states, that same survey was taken, and there, from my understanding, 80% of the residents of Michigan said they'd be willing to consider voting for a third-party candidate in 2008. I think the mood of the people is ready for a third party. It's interesting to me, too, that over in Iraq, the last report I heard, our government was happily sponsoring as many as 20 or more political parties to get involved in the new political process in Iraq. And so we're doing that there, but then you come back to the United States of America, and I'm sorry, if you're not a Republican or Democrat, then you don't have a right to compete.
But what about the argument that it's better to be practical, it's better to be a realist, it's better to pick the lesser of two evils? I mean, in your case, certainly the Republican Party, despite John McCain's past opposition to the pro-life movement, he claims to support it now. I mean, how would you respond to the lesser of two evils? Mr. Nader, maybe you want to begin.
Well, if you cast a least worst vote, without pulling the least worst candidate, John Kerry, say, or Barack Obama, in the direction of the 20 or so political constituencies, the Democratic Party, labor, women's rights, minorities, anti-poverty, environment, consumer, then you don't exert any pull at all, and the corporate interests are pulling on Obama and McCain 24/7. So it's a completely losing process, and that's why every 4 years both parties get worse. They get more corporate. Barack Obama is the first Democratic nominee to raise more money from corporate interests, Wall Street interests, and corporate attorneys than the Republican nominee, in this case John McCain. Why are these corporate interests investing in Barack Obama?
Let's let Mr. Baldwin take the last minute to answer them.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, the lesser of two evils, as I tried to mention a minute ago, is I think one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in, that whole mantra. You know, let me just speak to the evangelicals for a minute. If they were a first-century Christian and they had the opportunity to vote for Nero or Caligula, which one would they vote for? Would it be Nero because he would slaughter a few less people than Caligula? I mean, where do we go with this? The fact of the matter is, I would contend that the way that we have been treating these Republican candidates lately, the Republican administrations are actually more harmful than many of the Democrat administrations. I dare say that John Kerry would not have been able to get away with many of the things that George Bush was able to get away with, simply because he was a Republican and the conservatives and evangelicals were asleep at the wheel, therefore. So I would contend that this idea that one is lesser than the other isn't true. If you don't have somebody with a commitment to principle, a commitment to the Constitution, it really doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democrat. The carnage that results is felt throughout the country.
Okay, let's move on. The financial bailout, passed by Congress, vociferously denounced by some members of the House in both parties across the political spectrum, but supported by John McCain and Barack Obama, has so far failed to quell the turmoil in the financial markets, staunch foreclosures and bankruptcies, or stem job losses, which saw us shed 160,000 jobs last month and 750,000 jobs since the beginning of this year. To what extent is the bailout and the collapse of our economy an indictment of our ruling elites on both sides of the political spectrum? And does it presage a kind of political and moral collapse? And is there a link between the economic collapse and the inability to cope with natural disasters, to provide a decent public education for our young, missteps in foreign affairs, the failure for an adequate health care program, and certainly the protection of our constitutional rights? To what extent is this collapse reach beyond economics and become a kind of moral or social collapse within the country? And maybe you'd like to begin, Mr. Baldwin.
Yeah, this $700 billion bailout, which is just the first installment, it's already over $1 trillion. I read in USA Today that many more installments are in store. We don't really know how deep this is going to go. To me, this is a fraud perpetrated against the American people. I would personally hope that any of the congressmen that voted for it would be voted out of office on November the 4th by their constituents back home. I can't imagine those that call themselves conservatives, those that call themselves constitutionalists, that they could possibly support the socialization of our financial system, which is exactly what this is. I think we have to go back to 1913 when our country decided at that point in time to forfeit constitutional law relative to economics and forfeit sound money principles. They created this institution that we now know as the Federal Reserve, which is a private institution of international bankers, some of whom we don't even know who they are, most of whom are not citizens of the United States of America, but have created, in my judgment, the greatest fraud and hoax on the American people in the history of our country. And I really believe that what we are seeing now is simply the chickens coming home to roost. There's people like Ron Paul, by the way, whom I supported during the primary season, and I'm so thankful that Ron Paul endorsed me for president here just a few weeks ago.
Let's stop it there and give it to Mr. Nader.
Well, this is basically the last enactment of the collapse of corporate capitalist ideology. There are two ways corporations provide symbolic credibility for themselves. One is that they're patriotic. You know, they supply arms for our wars. And the second is that they bear the risks of market failure. And therefore they have to be meritorious or they go under. Well, first of all, they've lost their patriotism. Their giant corporations have no allegiance anymore to our country other than to control it or ship its industries and jobs to fascist and communist dictatorships. And second, unlike small business, where the remnants of capitalist principles prevail, they're free to go bankrupt. These giant corporations go to Washington for a bailout. But it's the worst kind of bailout. It's a bailout that's very vague, has no standards, doesn't have re-regulation, doesn't have anything for preventing home foreclosures. It doesn't have anything to give shareholders more power to control the company they own and restrain the bosses. And it doesn't have anything for criminal prosecution of the crooks or making the speculators pay for their own bailout with a tiny 0.1% tax on $500 trillion of derivative transactions this year, which has produced $500 billion. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a stock transaction tax, and we financed part of the Civil War. We've got to bring it back. That's the Nader-Gonzalez platform on this bailout when Congress comes back in January. They've got to do these things.
Let's open this up for 5 minutes, and I want to begin by asking both of you, the idea of the free market in many ways, or laissez-faire capitalism, argues that the social contract, there is no difference between the social and the commercial contract. And certainly within our courts of law, there is no distinction between the social and the commercial contract. And because there is no distinction, I wonder if we have destroyed that vital concept of the common good within our democracy. In our political science theorists, our economic theorists, and maybe you'd like to begin, Mr. Baldwin.
Well, again, I go back to what I said a minute ago, Chris. I really believe that what we have here is a fraud. We have, we create money out of thin air. We create a fiat money supply that's backed by nothing. There's nothing of substance behind our supposed wealth. We've become the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. We're $10 trillion in debt and growing. There's no end in sight, and the only answer that they can come up with is we got to borrow more money. My dad only had an 8th grade education. But I think, judging by what I see going on in this city today, I think my dad was smarter than most of the people on Capitol Hill and in Wall Street. My dad had a saying, and he said, son, if your outgo exceed your income, your upkeep will be your downfall.
And so how would you respond to the crisis that we're facing? What do you propose?
One of the first things I would propose, I would like to appoint someone like Ron Paul, Secretary of the Treasury. And I would like to, as soon as possible, eliminate the Federal Reserve entirely. I would like to eliminate the Internal Revenue Service. I'd like to overturn the 16th Amendment and the income tax. I would like to put America on sound money once again. I believe that the federal government should lead the way in that. I believe that they should create an institution by which they only use sound money. I think the corporate world would soon follow suit if they would do that because they would see the advantage of it.
So does that mean you oppose government intervention of any kind, whether to relieve people who are being foreclosed or bail out Wall Street?
I think we have to get back to the true free market. I really believe that, sure, there's some tough times that could come because of the situation that we now find ourselves. But look, we're either going to let the free market take over, and we're going to find ourselves then bottoming out, and then I think in a relatively short period of time coming back again, because the free market works. It always has, it always will.
Okay, let's let Mr. Nader take the last section here and respond to that. And if you could please tell us, Mr. Nader, what you propose to handle the collapse, the financial collapse we're facing.
Well, I just mentioned that re-regulation, deregulation under Clinton opened the doors to an orgy of excess and speculative behavior, as Richard Fisher, the head of the Federal Reserve Office in Dallas, said the other day. We need to give more power to the shareholders. The shareholders are supposed to control what they own, but they're told to sell out if they don't like the way the bosses are enriching themselves and running the company into the ground in a classic conflict of interest. And also, we need criminal prosecution, law and order. People are demanding justice for these corporate crooks in Wall Street and elsewhere. But the point that you raised, the social compact, every society that has subverted social values to commercial supremacy goes down. Every major religion in the world has urged many, many centuries ago its adherents not to give too much power to the merchant class. What we've seen in this country is a complete reverse. NAFTA and WTO are part of that. The subordination of civic values, health, safety, access to justice, etc., respect for posterity, to the supremacy of commercial values. And that is being installed in Washington, D.C., in state capitals, in city municipal centers. There's a quiet coup d'etat that's been going on, and the American people have got to wake up to it and do something about it.
Good. Well, let's move on to the next question, which revolves around the fact that both Senator McCain and Senator Obama endorse what President Bush calls the global war on terror as perhaps the heart of U.S. policy. They have said that they would continue the preemptive wars in Iraq. Certainly Senator Obama calls for downsizing, but not an end to American military presence in Iraq. And both of these candidates talk for an augmentation in troop levels in the war in Afghanistan. Both Senators McCain and Obama say that they will increase the size and budget of the American military, and they, of course, would like to transfer or send at least 10,000 more troops to the Afghan theater as soon as they take power. Secondly, these candidates in their campaign have refused to censure Israel for the siege of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip or the occupation of the West Bank, or since the beginning of the Second Palestinian Uprising or Intifada in September 2000, the Israeli army has killed more than 860 children. I would like you to respond to their Middle Eastern policy, to their perpetuation of the so-called war on terror, and perhaps answer the Middle East correspondent for The Independent in London, Robert Fisk, who has written and argues that for the Muslim world it will make no difference who wins the election. Do you agree with this assessment? What do you see as the consequences of the Republican and Democratic approaches to these conflicts in the Middle East? And how do you respond to their uncritical support for Israel's government? Thank you. And I think Mr. Nader begins this session.
Well, the foreign affairs reporters for the Washington Post and New York Times this spring wrote articles saying that the foreign policy of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton will be very much like the second term of George W. Bush. And Barack Obama has demonstrated that. There was such a similarity during their so-called debates. They were belligerent toward Iran. They were totally uncritically supportive of the Israeli military repression, devastation, occupation, and colonization of Palestine and its people. You know, when Barack Obama went over there, he spent 45 minutes in the West Bank, and all the rest of the time was in Israel. The casualty toll was 400 casualties, civilian casualties, to one Israeli casualty in the skirmishes that are going on between Gaza and the Israelis. Now, if he did that to the Israelis, he would be accused of anti-Semitism against the Jewish people. He did that to the Arabs, not a single sentence of compassion and what they are going through. And I accuse Barack Obama of anti-Semitism against the Arab peoples. They're both part of the Semitic race, Arabs in greater number than Jews, and it's time to pin that description on both McCain and Obama for their callousness beyond belief as they grovel to the militaristic Israeli lobby called AIPAC, which doesn't even represent a majority of Jewish Americans. And a majority of Jewish Americans, Arab Americans, Israelis and Palestinians want a two-state solution, and they worked it out in Geneva, the Israeli and Palestinian peace movement, and that's what Nader Gonzalez would support, the Palestinian-Israeli peace movements who have worked out in detail a two-state accord. Iraq is just more U.S. soldiers, more U.S. Bases are going to remain in Iraq, maybe at a reduced level, but it still will be seen by Iraqis as a military occupation.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Baldwin.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I think this is just a part of the bigger picture, and that is that what we have going on today in America, and this is something that I try to communicate as I travel around the country, to try to make people understand is really what we're facing today is not a battle between Republicans and Democrats, because those titles mean very little. Same thing, it's not a battle between conservatives and liberals. Really, the battle today is between globalists and constitutionalists. We either believe the Constitution, we either believe that we are a constitutional republic and we govern ourselves accordingly, or we see ourselves as a part of, as George Bush Sr. talked about, the New World Order. And I think what you're dealing with here is an infatuation with both parties to the New World Order concept. The open border situation, neither party is going to close our borders to illegal immigration. I think that's all involved. Both of the parties seem to be obsessed with foreign aid. I don't think you're going to see any change in foreign aid, whether it's Barack Obama or John McCain. If I'm President of the United States in 2009, one of the first things we're going to do is stop foreign aid, and that means across the board. Our founding fathers were very clear that we should engage in free trade and fair trade, in dialogue and discourse and intercourse with foreign nations, but entangling alliances with none. But we've allowed ourselves to become the pawns of the United Nations, and we do pretty much what the United Nations says that we should do, and this creates this entire spectrum that you're now describing, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in Europe. We seem to be submerging American interests to the interest of globalist corporations and entities.
Okay, let's talk about two issues. First, the concept of preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is defined as a criminal war of aggression, has become a centerpiece of American policy. And both parties, rather than debating the validity under international law of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the occupation of these countries, debate the terms of the occupation. Why don't you begin, Mr. Nader?
Well, a preemptive war, unconstitutionally asserted, violates our federal statutes, international treaties that we belong to, and our Constitution. It's really quite remarkable that Congress, ever ready to abandon its constitutional responsibilities, shoves them over to the White House and basically says to George W. Bush, you decide when to invade Iraq. You decide how much attacks you're going to make on Afghanistan or Western Pakistan. What we're seeing here is a lawlessness that has become institutionalized. It's not just sporadic. It's tied up with this unitary president, the diminution of Congress, diminution of the judicial branch, and it basically strips the people of their sovereignty. And it looks like that Barack Obama, who's a constitutional law specialist, has not informed the American people about international law that circumscribes his belligerent parallelism with John McCain. Like they can go anywhere in the world, they can do anything in the world. We have far more to lose than those stateless terrorists. Far more to lose. And if we don't uphold the rule of law and international law and the Nuremberg principles, we're going to be much more vulnerable to stateless terrorists. We'll be, in effect, giving them the support of their community by invading, supporting dictators and oligarchs that suppress their own people and continually occupying territories like Iraq and portions of Afghanistan, and maybe soon Iran, in terms of the belligerence that both Obama and McCain have demonstrated to a country that hasn't invaded anyone in 250 years.
Just so Mr. Baldwin has time, but a brief question, then do you support immediate withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan? Mr. Nader.
Pardon?
Just quickly, do you support immediate withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I support a 6-month negotiated withdrawal of all soldiers and corporate contractors from Iran, continued humanitarian aid. We owe moral obligation to a country that we've blown apart, that didn't threaten us, and UN-sponsored elections. In terms of Afghanistan, more U.S. soldiers like throwing fire on gasoline in that area. It will not work. It will involve many civilian casualties and increase the resistance there. And if it destabilizes Pakistan, it's going to make Iraq look like a bonfire. So we have to not send those soldiers over, but deal with negotiation, as people like Ashraf Ghani and other very knowledgeable Americans of Afghani descent have detailed in a great fashion. It would be nice if the Sunday shows would have someone like Ashraf Ghani on, someone who actually knows what's going on over there.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Baldwin.
Right. The Constitution is very clear. Only Congress can declare war. I've said all over the country that when Chuck Baldwin was President of the United States, I would never send American forces to invade and occupy another country without a declaration of war from Congress first. I'm absolutely emphatic about that. We must get back to the rule of law, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. What we should have done is what Ron Paul suggested back in 2001 when he introduced his Bill of Marque and Reprisal, which is exactly what Thomas Jefferson did whenever confronted with the Barbary pirates back during his administration. I believe if we would have done it that way and used whatever private or special operations forces were necessary to deal with these rogue terrorist states like Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and so forth, I personally believe that those people would have been either dead or captured, that the Al-Qaeda threat would be pretty much over, and over 4,000 of our best young men and women would not have died in the sands of Iraq.
And how would you respond now, the fact that we have U.S. troops and, of course, a large mercenary force stationed in Iraq,
right,
and troops stationed in Afghanistan who are dying now at a faster rate than soldiers and Marines in Iraq? How would you deal as President with those two situations?
I've said throughout this campaign that I would issue a directive to bring our troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan as quickly and as safely and as securely as possible. Obviously, you do not extract that amount of personnel, military and civilian, from a combat theater overnight. You have to have a plan in place that will protect them as you withdraw. But I think it's critical that we withdraw as soon as safely possible. Think about this too, Chris. Not only are we bogged down in a sandbox over there and our people cannot maneuver and we're vulnerable, we have a growing threat from China moving into the Panama Canal region. We have saber rattling going on with Russia. We have some very serious threats outside of Iraq and Iran. And what we're doing is reducing our overall military at the same time. When Ronald Reagan left office, we had over 600 ships in our Navy. Now we have a little over 200. So while we have been focused on what's going on in Iraq and the Middle East, we're losing sight of the overall picture. I really believe that we need to build our Navy and bring our military strength back to what it was when Ronald Reagan left office. At the same time, we cannot tolerate using the rubric of we are having a war on terror to pass things like the Patriot Act, which attack the civil liberties of the American people.
That's the next question, so we'll go to that.
Okay.
Sergeant Nick Morgan, who tonight is, as we speak, undergoing reconstructive surgery to repair damage done to his lower orbital after being trampled on by mounted police when he demonstrated against the Iraq War. He's an Iraq War veteran, outside the presidential debate at Hofstra University. And if you want to see that incident, you can go into YouTube and type in Iraq vet crushed by police horse at presidential debate. Sent me by email a question that he wanted to ask each of you about the stripping away of constitutional rights through, of course, as you mentioned, the Patriot Reform Act, but as well the President's signing statements, which have allowed George Bush to essentially disobey more than 750 laws enacted since he took office, the FISA Reform Act, the suspension of habeas corpus, the open use of torture in our offshore penal colonies, and of course the recent decision to station a combat brigade on American soil, ostensibly to quell any potential civil unrest. Sergeant Morgan asks how, given these egregious erosions of our rights and the fact that these were passed in many cases or supported by a democratically controlled Congress, what mechanism do we have to roll back these curtailments of our civil liberties and see constitutional guarantees reinstated? And I think, Mr. Baldwin, you are first.
All right, thank you. It flows in nicely with what I just said. I am convinced that all that you just suggested is a very real threat to America. What good is it to fight a war for democracy, in quotes, halfway around the world, to turn around and here in the United States of America take away, steal, abrogate the rights and freedoms that are enumerated for us in our Constitution and Bill of Rights? And that's exactly what's going on, as you just suggested. I'm very concerned about this, and I really believe that every conservative, every person that would claim an allegiance to constitutional government would have to be concerned about it. Personally, I'm a little alarmed that many of the evangelical Christians and people that call themselves conservatives have just kind of rolled over and played dead as they've watched President Bush do the things that you just described. We should all take it very seriously when any of our civil liberties and our individual rights as enumerated in the Bill of Rights are taken from us. As President of the United States, one of the first things I would do is I would review all of the signing statements and executive orders that have taken place over the last several administrations, the Clinton administration, the 2 Bush administrations, and probably wind up reversing about 95% of those. I would like to restore habeas corpus. I would like to restore the Fourth Amendment. I would like to overturn the Patriot Act. I even have serious reservations about the Department of Homeland Security. I think that the people who are concerned about our country becoming a police state, I think those concerns are very valid. And I think it's ludicrous that we who call ourselves conservatives would stand back and allow this to happen just because it happens to be a professing conservative who's at the top of the ticket.
Thank you. Mr. Nader?
The Conservative American Bar Association in 2005-2006 has sent 3 white papers to George W. Bush declaring in detail systematic violations of our Constitution. For example, snooping on millions of Americans or lots of Americans without judicial approval. Now, that means that the criticism of the Bush administration for violating our Constitution has gone mainstream in the legal profession. What we need to do first is demand that the impeachment authority be exercised by Congress. Pelosi and Reid, when they took over the Congress in 2007, took impeachment off the table. The way to reinstate a tradition of constitutionalism is to punish the president and vice president for 5 systemic high crimes and misdemeanors: criminal war in Iraq, systemic torture, incarceration without charges, denial of habeas corpus, spying on Americans without judicial approval, and the signing statements that you just mentioned. The second is the people of this country, zeroing in on their 2 senators and representatives, have got to get statutes enacted that make these constitutional provisions enforceable in courts of law by citizens. Right now, citizens have no standing to sue. There's no enforceability. You're more likely to get penalized if you violate a traffic ordinance than if a politician violates the Constitution. And then third, and very important, is that we need in this country to have direct democracy. If the Congress does not enforce the Constitution, we have to have procedures for binding national referendums with access to the mass media. And I also have one quick bill we're going to talk about in a few days. Anytime Congress and the White House engulf the United States in a war abroad, all able-bodied and age-qualified children and grandchildren of all members of Congress, President and Vice President, are immediately drafted into the armed forces. That will focus them on the declaration of war authority being held in Congress under a deliberative process, not given arbitrarily to George W. Bush in defiance of our framers of our Constitution.
Let me ask both of you, and maybe we'll begin with Mr. Baldwin. When you look at these bills, from the FISA Reform Act all the way to the Patriot Reform Act, do you believe that they were passed, or certainly that the architects of those bills wrote them and passed them primarily to deal with the potential of terrorism on American soil, or to curtail the civil liberties of Americans who are carrying out their constitutional right of dissent?
Well, Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, he talked about if these things, these abuses that he referred to, if they were sporadic, you might get the idea that they were not orchestrated. But when you begin to see a design behind these things, you have to conclude that there is something more than just a sporadic, accidental theme going on. It seems to me that we are inching closer and closer and closer to a police state style form of federal government. And I do believe that there is a design behind it. I don't think it's accidental. And one of the reasons I say that, in the Patriot Act in particular, if you recall, Chris, back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was in the White House and the Republicans were in Congress, the same piece of legislation was introduced by the Democrat administration. The Republicans rejected that bill out of hand. They saw it for what it was, an abridgment of our constitutional freedoms, especially the Fourth Amendment. And so it was defeated. But then after 2001, and President Bush is now sponsoring this bill, now then you have the Republicans in the Congress as well, and they pass the legislation. They called it the Patriot Act, but it was the same piece of legislation that came before the Congress in the 1990s. So again, it wasn't just a reaction to 9/11. If it was just a reaction to 9/11, then why was it introduced in the Congress a decade earlier?
Mr. Nader.
Well, I think in many ways what has happened is that when there is an attack like 9/11, and the government is expected to respond, and it responds with a whole series of restrictions that facilitate dragnet enforcement, which is very inefficient and violates the civil liberties of a lot of innocent people. In this round, it was Muslim Americans, for example, who were thrown in jail without charges or habeas corpus rights. When that happens, we have to ask ourselves, what are the collateral benefits to George W. Bush or whoever is in the White House? And here are the collateral benefits. He concentrated more power in the White House at the expense of Congress and the courts. He chilled out the Democratic Party and stifled dissent in the country because it's all terror, terror, terror. The third is he distracted attention from the necessities of the American people by focusing abroad, Osama bin Laden, Osama bin Laden. I mean, look at his speech records. They're huge references to this criminal gang. Far more than references to the health, safety, and economic well-being of America. And finally, he makes his corporate buddies incredibly rich by the expansion of these budgets like Homeland Security and Department of Defense. That's the danger of out of control and disproportionate reaction to this attack, in that it centralizes power in the White House and reduces our democratic processes at an accelerated rate that we would never have foreseen. That's why the American people have got to have a force field if we have another terrorist attack, stateless terrorist attack, or another one. We have to have a force field so that we don't turn into a de facto police state.
Thank you. John R. MacArthur, in his new book, You Can't Be President, The Outrageous Barriers to Democracy in America, details the numerous obstacles laid down by the two major parties, both of which you're more than well aware of, to prevent insurgents, such as yourselves, or even independents within their own parties, people like Ned Lamott, who challenged Senator Lieberman, or Dennis Kucinich, from achieving power. He argues in the book that these obstacles have become so egregious that we should, as is happening now in Vermont with the Progressive Party, focus on local politics and build up a grassroots movement rather than try and confront the national behemoths. This seems to be working somewhat in Vermont. The Progressive Party now has 6 members in the 150-member Vermont House. It is mounting a credible campaign for governor. Anthony Polina is actually now outpolling the Democratic candidate, and of course Vermont has elected Bernie Sanders to the Senate. Given the corporate control, which you have both spoken about, of the presidential debates and the electoral process, the fact that you, in many ways, both of you as candidates have been blackballed by the mainstream media, isn't there some validity to Mr. MacArthur's argument that perhaps the best way to break the two-party duopoly is to put all of our energies into fighting things like big box stores or developers or getting on the city council rather than investing time and energy in perhaps what might be termed quixotic campaigns for president? And we'll begin with you, Mr. Nader.
Fine. You know, what are they waiting for? In every locality, they can do that. Now, Vermont is a little bit idiosyncratic in that way. It's rural and small towns, and you can knock on every door. If you try to do that in New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, it's much more difficult, requires a lot more money, and the two-party or single-party domination of politics there is a real obstacle. But when we campaign around the country, Nader Gonzalez campaign, we ally ourselves with progressive local officials. We ally ourselves with citizens who are fighting injustices around the country, whether it's toxic exposure to children in south central Los Angeles or blowing off mountains by the coal barons in West Virginia, or a whole variety of areas. So we understand it takes both. You have to have a national visibility and a national campaign and show how the national affects the local, and of course the local can show how the local enhances the national. But Anthony Polina, for example, would not appear with me in Vermont because he didn't want to alienate the Democrats and perhaps Bernie Sanders, who he was a staff assistant to. So it sounds good, but we're a long way from developing a national and local agenda that we can all band together on. I mean, when you have people like Chomsky and Zinn, who are basically supporting Obama, who is a warmonger, who is a promoter of bigger military budgets, of foreign invasions and interventions, and who wants to provide more weapon systems, and doesn't challenge the military-industrial complex, and is a corporatist to the core. You can see that the left, the liberal, the progressive, have got a lot of work to do.
Mr. Baldwin.
I think if the American people really understood how the political process is being manipulated by the two major parties and by the national media as a whole, and a caveat here to say thank you to you, Chris, and thank you to C-SPAN and AP that's here to cover this debate. If the American people really understood the depths at which they go to manipulate the process, I really believe they would be outraged, and I really believe the American people themselves would change it. They don't really realize what we have to go through just to get on the ballot, the amount of money that it takes and effort that it takes just to get on the ballot. And then, of course, notice that we're not invited to the major debates. And they say, well, you don't poll enough. But then, of course, you look at the fact that we have enough state ballots that we could obtain, theoretically, the necessary 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. Now, that is a huge undertaking. And there's only a few candidates that thus qualify.
6.
Mr. Nader and myself and the others that are not here, 6 in total. And you could put all 6 of those candidates up in front of the American people, let them present their views and their ideas to them, and let the American people decide for themselves the ideas that they thought were best suited for our country's future.
Let's talk specifically about the obstacles that both of you face, so that perhaps the audience can get a sense of the hurdles that Rick MacArthur has detailed in his book. And maybe you could begin, Mr. Nader.
First of all, we face obstacles in raising money. I mean, Obama raises more in one day than our entire campaign, which is going to be run on $4 million. And we about the only way we can raise money is on the internet, votenader.org, for anybody who's interested in contributing, and over live television like C-SPAN. The mails are exorbitantly expensive now to do it that way. We have events around the country where we raise funds, but by and large, it's very difficult. Now, one reason is that people think we can't win. Well, you can't win if you're not on the debates. Every national poll since 2000 have said a majority of the people want Ralph Nader on those debates. And in fact, they're very close to 50% on all the small candidates. Because the people in this country don't look at debates as simply antidotes to insomnia. They want a little broader framework. The second is, just think what we have to do. Jason Kafoury, our coordinator, he came May 20th, we were not on one state. In an incredible pressure cooker summer, we're now on 45 states. But what we had to do is challenge the states with litigation. We had to get a huge number of signatures in a short period of time. In 2004, the Democrats filed 24 lawsuits in 18 states in 12 weeks to get us off ballots like Pennsylvania and Ohio. And it's just a monstrous violation of our civil liberties. No Western country obstructs voters and candidates from participating in elections like the state laws in about half the states. And there's no sensitivity to these Jim Crow type laws against small and independent candidates. No sensitivity by the major media, by the major columnists, by the editorials. You know, they'll flip over when they see gerrymandered districts, where one major party doesn't even want to compete with the other. And 90% of the House of Representative districts are one-party districts. As Mr. Baldwin said, people realize they don't even have two choices in most congressional districts, just the incumbent, either Republican or Democrat. But there's a great sensitivity, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others around the country, about the civil liberties of candidates. And if you don't have candidate rights, voter rights aren't worth as much, because they're not given the choices.
Mr. Baldwin.
And I really think the national media bears much of the blame for this. They are supposed to be the watchdogs on government. They are supposed to be the ones that protect the free debate and the free exchange of ideas. That is their purpose. That is their function. Instead, I think most of the American people that are watching this debate right now would agree when I say that the major media, for the most part, has become pretty much lapdogs for the two major parties. No one else is invited to the dance, not because they don't have ideas that are worth considering, not because they cannot exchange debate and be a part of the process, have something to bring to the table. I think Ron Paul is a classic example of this in the Republican, Dennis Kucinich in the Democrat side. I mean, these guys were treated like they had the plague by members of their own party. The national media, until Ron Paul started breaking in $20-something million, until he did that, he was virtually unknown by the major media. And again, it seems to be a definite, determined effort on behalf of the two major parties in concert with the national media to keep third-party expression out of the debate. And I really think it's up to the American people at some point. Everything comes back to we the people, doesn't it, Chris? I mean, at some point it always comes back to we the people. And I would hope that people that are listening and watching this debate would realize the significance of this and how their fundamental freedoms are being denied them by not allowing third parties to participate in the free exchange of ideas.
Mr. Nader, perhaps you could just give us an example from the state of Texas, what it takes to get on the ballot.
The primary in Texas is March 4th, and we have about 2 months to get about 140,000 signatures, because the state arbitrarily and on vague criteria can disqualify thousands of signatures. So as an independent candidate, we have to get 68,000 signatures verified. Now, when you're on the street with the clipboards, under Texas law, if Texans voted in the primary on March 4th, they cannot sign the petition to get you on the ballot as a candidate for president. in nearby Arizona, which has now been invalidated, we won a Ninth Circuit case. We're starting to win litigation here, finally. And Arizona said petitioners have to be resident of Arizona to collect signatures for federal office seekers. That doesn't make sense. People want to bring in their friends from Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. It's banned. They can be prosecuted. In Oklahoma, someone wanted to put an initiative on the ballot. The Attorney General indicted them for a crime. They may go to jail. Why? Because they had petitioners, some of them were from out of state. I mean, this is Jim Crow laws. We've seen this before against African Americans. Only this time, it's against small candidates and third parties, the only people really who provide a competitive push, a tugboat push or pull to the two stodgy parties who are looking more and more alike.
Thank you. The last question concerns health care. There are differences, certainly, between Senator Obama and Senator McCain's health care plans. However, each seeks to work with health care corporations that profit from illnesses and the sickness of tens of millions of Americans. Senators Obama and McCain, in essence, claim that they can coax these for-profit health care corporations, all of which are listed on the stock exchange and formed to maximize profit, to transform themselves into social service agencies that will provide adequate health care for Americans. Physicians for a National Health Program and Harvard Medical School estimated that we would save $350 billion a year with a national health plan. But since Medicare does not make campaign contributions, and these private health care companies do, with medical and insurance interests giving Barack Obama $708,000 between 2001 and 2006, we hear no discussion in this national campaign between Republicans and Democrats about a national single-payer, not-for-profit health care insurance program. Dr. John Gaiman, the former chair of family medicine at the University of Washington and author of Do Not Resuscitate, Why the Health Industry is Dying and How We Must Replace It, argues that the attempt by Senator McCain and Senator Obama to tweak the for-profit health care system will not work because the for-profit health care companies will always fragment risk pools, essentially not insuring those likely to have serious illness, to make money. He writes that its administrative costs will always be 5 to 8 times higher than public financing through Medicare, and finally its loyalty will always be to its shareholders rather than to its enrollees and patients. We clearly face a crisis, 46 million Americans without coverage, tens of millions of additional Americans with inadequate health care policies that will not cover catastrophic illnesses. And Dr. Gaiman writes that, especially with premiums up 87% since 2000, health care is simply becoming impossible to afford for millions of Americans. They simply don't have the money to be insured. Can you comment on the health care plans of the two candidates? Can you tell us how your plans would differ from the candidates, and how you would deal with a for-profit health care industry that has spent tens of millions of dollars on lobbying groups in Washington to destroy the possibility of a national health care plan and to resist any kind of regulation? Mr. Baldwin.
Yeah, I think when you look at the health care plans as promoted by both these senators, I think you have to acknowledge, and this is going to be probably an area where Ralph and I are going to differ somewhat, I think you have to acknowledge that however it's carved, both the Democratic plan and the Republican plan are calling for more and more government intervention. It's more and more socialism. I remember, I don't remember who said it, but I love what he said. He said, you know, there's no problem so bad that government cannot make worse. And I think that's what we have going on in a whole variety of issues. We started talking about the financial bailout and how that we're socializing our financial systems. Now then we're hearing calls for socialized medicine, not just from the Democrat side of the aisle, but also from the Republicans. They may not come out and blatantly use those terms, but the essence of what they're proposing is more government interventionism. Our position is that the constitutional government requires free market to work. We believe that health care would be more affordable, it would be better maintained if government got out of it. We believe that the free market system will, in the end, provide a better system than anything the government chooses to mix with it. You know, most of us that are a little bit older here in this audience can remember there was a time whenever most Americans could afford to go to the doctor. They didn't have to sell their car to do it, or, you know, not buy groceries to get their health care. There was a time when health care was affordable, and even the common person without insurance could afford it for the most part. All of this has evolved because of the integration of
We'll go
government.
back to this issue. Let's get Mr. Nader just to do his 90-second response.
Well, Senator Obama and Senator McCain leave the present system intact, dominated by giant health insurance companies like Aetna and Cigna, who have a perverse market incentive to deny claims, restrict claims, exclude different kinds of ailments, and have this notorious pre-existing condition affect these policies and all their fine print. Healthcare is very similar to fire prevention and police security. People die. People get sick. People get sicker. People have injuries that are not treated because they can't afford health insurance. The Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Science, estimates 18,000 Americans die every year because they can't afford health insurance. That's 6 9/11s every year. Over 1 million people since President Truman first proposed universal health care. This is not socialized medicine when you talk about single payer. It is full government insurance with private delivery of health care, free choice of doctor and hospital, which the HMO corporations do not allow you these days, and quality and cost controls. A pay-or-die system cannot be justified on market fundamentalism. It's too cruel. There's $230 billion of computerized billing fraud and abuse, $350 billion of corporate bureaucratic expenses that can be saved and put toward covering people who are not now covered.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to you, Mr. Baldwin, since you argue that the free market should handle health care. For those who aren't on Medicare, for those who depend on the free market, let's say a family of 4, now spends about $12,000 a year just in premiums. That is an expense that is arguably unreachable for probably 40% of American households who live on about $40,000 a year. These premiums, as I mentioned, have gone up 87% since 2000. If you trust the free market, if there isn't government intervention, how do you respond to the rapacious demand of for-profit healthcare industries that are bleeding American families dry?
Yeah, I would never suggest that whether you're talking about Social Security or Medicare or any such thing as that, that you walk in one day and say, oh, by the way, that you no longer have that benefit. It's not free market. It no longer exists. I mean, that's not only is that not reasonable, in my opinion, it's not moral. You can't do that. You have many people that are older, 40s, 50s, 60s, and older, that have paid into the system, people that depend on it. It's a part of not only of their lives, it's part of their psyche. I think we have to allow that to continue for those persons. I think what we have to get around to realize is that for the future generations, for those that are in their 20s and 30s, that have their whole careers, their lives in front of them, that to give them the opportunity to invest in private insurance, to invest in private sources, that would allow them a greater return when they are 50 and 60 years of age than anything that they would get out of Medicare and Social Security and any other government-backed organization or program. I think that's what we have to get around to. And unless we're willing to do that, the other result is, or the other course is, to simply do more and more toward what Mr. McCain and Mr. Obama are suggesting, which is more government, more socialism, however you define it, and less free market. And as we're seeing in every area of our society, whether it's financial, whether it's medical, whether it's, we're talking about the Patriot Act and all these other things, it's bigger and bigger government, more and more socialism. Sooner or later, we got to get back to constitutionalism.
So how do you prevent these companies from, as Dr. Gaiman said, skimming off the healthier part of the population and leaving the people who most need health care uninsured or underinsured? What mechanism do you put in place so that people who are most in need of a health care system are not shunted aside because it interferes with corporate profits?
I'm certainly not opposed to regulation. I think that regulation is very needful. I'm not saying at all that we just allow corporations to run, as you say, roughshod over people. I think that there's a lot of accusation that can be made against some of these. For example, what we have going on Wall Street. I tell you what, if I were President of the United States, I believe that there is cause for prosecution on some of these. I don't want to give them, these Wall Street banksters, and I use that word intentionally, I don't want to give them $700 billion of taxpayer money. I want to see some of them go to jail. I think they have defrauded the American people. I think they're criminals, and I think they should pay for their crimes. I think certainly there is accountability that must be enacted across the board, and for far too long we've let these kind of things go, and we should not and dare not continue to do that.
So you would impose government regulation that would prohibit these companies from excluding people?
No, I'm not saying that exclusively. No, I'm not saying that directly. I'm not referring to a particular program. I mean, obviously, we're not talking details here on a particular program, which would have to be studied and so forth.
All right, let's let Mr. Nader respond then to this.
Well, I mean, it is clear the bottom 100 million Americans who are poor die earlier because they don't have health care and they can't afford health insurance. They get sick or sicker or have their injuries not treated. Now, that overrides market ideology, but the key thing is that these giant HMOs are increasingly dominating market share. Like you have 3 or 4 of them that dominate 2/3 of the HMO membership in the country. And they're not being exposed to antitrust prosecutions in order to loosen up and have more quality competition. We're the only Western country in the Western world that doesn't have universal health care. The majority of the people favor full Medicare for all with private delivery of health care. 59% of physicians in an April poll favor full Medicare for all with private delivery because they want to practice medicine, not bookkeeping. So there's a huge constituency here in favor of it, but who says no? It's not the people who say no. It's a few giant hospital chains, a few giant drug companies subsidized to the hilt by the U.S. taxpayer from the NIH research to tax credits, and a few giant HMOs, all of which are paying their executives $5,000, $6,000, $8,000, $9,000 an hour. I mean, it's the perfect example of a plutocracy that says to the American people, if you can't afford health care, you're going to have to risk not having it. In other words, a pay or die system. We can't tolerate that in the land of the free, home of the brave.
Thank you. In this part of the debate, each candidate will be permitted to ask a single question of the other, again with a 90-second response, and then a discussion, and maybe you would like to begin, Mr. Baldwin, asking Mr. Nader a question.
All right, thank you, Chris. Ralph, what would you do if you were President of the United States to secure our country's borders?
We have to secure our country's borders for a lot of reasons. Criminal smuggling, infectious diseases, pollution both ways, north and south, all kinds of illegal entries. But we should stop supporting dictators and oligarchs who so impoverish and brutalize their people in Mexico and Central America that they drive these people north and across the border in order to feed their families. I don't think any of us would not do that if we were faced with the same situation. We have to crack down on the large employers who love to have unlawful workers because they can exploit them without any resistance. They're frightened, of course, because they're not here with proper papers. And they bring down the standards, wage and worker standards, on other low-income workers who happen to be largely minority. I would have a $10 minimum wage, which is exactly the same as 1968 adjusted for inflation. I mean, that's how far we're going backwards into the future, even though worker productivity has doubled. And at a $10 wage, more people will take these jobs than at a federal minimum wage now of $6.55, if it is even observed. And finally, I would oppose brain draining the third world with these H-1B visas to enrich Microsoft, Cisco, and Intel and others who want to take scientists, engineers, doctors, nurses, entrepreneurs from those countries at the same time that we are saying to those countries, you have to develop your economies.
Do we respond to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
My position on that, Ralph, is that, as Ronald Reagan said, a nation without borders is not a nation. And I believe it is absolutely critical, not only to our culture and our society in general, but to our security as a free people, that we stop this invasion of illegal aliens that's taking place. We are the most compassionate nation in the world. We take in more legal immigrants than all the rest of the nations of the world combined. But obviously we have a problem in Washington, D.C. when neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have any intention, Barack Obama, John McCain, neither one, will do anything to secure our borders. If I'm President of the United States, the first thing I would do after being sworn in on January 20th, 2009, is I would free Border Patrol agents Ramos and Campion. I would go to the prison personally and release them, give them their freedom, give them their jobs back with back pay, should they desire it. I would then increase whatever security was necessary to keep those borders secure. If that meant National Guard troops, they would not be sent to Iraq, Chris, to guard the borders of Iraq. They would guard the borders of the United States of America. If I had to use regular military personnel to secure our borders, I would do that. The second thing I would do is I would aggressively prosecute those employers who knowingly hire illegal aliens. As far as I'm concerned, they're criminals, and they are aiding and abetting criminal activity, and they should be held accountable.
Thank you. Mr. Nader?
Yes, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Baldwin, the following. I take it you are an originalist. You want the Constitution to be interpreted strictly, and you probably like Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas, the corporation as a word doesn't appear in our Constitution. Yet in 1886, in a rogue Supreme Court opinion that wasn't even in the opinion, it was in the head notes written by the scribe, a railroad was given equal protection under the laws as a person under our Constitution. Now, I spoke with Justice Scalia a few days ago, and I said, you know, I sent you 2 letters over the last 2 years asking, as the prime originalist on the Supreme Court, where do you stand on artificial entities like corporations, not their employees, having the same constitutional rights as real human beings? It just doesn't seem reflective of the Constitution. And he said, well, it's been settled for so long, I haven't done the research and I haven't thought about it. If we get a case, then I'll do the research and I'll think about it, but I don't have time to do it now. I want to ask you, do you think corporations as artificial entities should have equal constitutional rights with real human beings, especially the right to engage in politics, to engage in elections, to set up PACs, and to lobby legislatures?
The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, was written for a free people. And I believe that the civil liberties that you're speaking of pertain to people. I am opposed to corporate welfare, just as I'm sure you are. I am opposed to all that has been done lately to corporatize our political systems. And this is where you and I are going to be in great agreement. I believe that the corporations of America today hold sway over the 2 political parties. I think this was seen in the bailout. We both know that both Barack Obama and John McCain received millions of dollars from Freddie and Fannie, and they just both happened to get up and support the bailout. So I think we see this throughout both parties, and it's a part of the problem that we have today. And I certainly concur that the rights and freedoms that are expressed in these great documents are for persons.
Not for corporations.
Not for corporations.
Well, that's going to be a growing convergence of the so-called left and the right. And I think the consequences of subordinating the corporate entity to the sovereignty of the people, because the Constitution doesn't start we the corporation,
right.
It starts we the people.
Exactly.
The consequences for sound public policy and for redressing this enormous imbalance of power between corporate power and people power will be quite beneficial for our democracy.
We're going to ask a few questions from the audience, and I'm going to throw in a couple questions too, and then each of you will have a 2-minute closing statement before we finish. I'd like to first deal with the issue of global warming. How serious a problem do you think it is? Do you consider it man-made, and what do you propose to do about it, Mr. Baldwin?
I'm very skeptical about Al Gore's interpretation of global warming. I prefer personally to believe that it's cyclical and natural. I certainly do not subscribe to the version of global warming that many on the left seem to perpetuate. So my personal feeling is I'm skeptical. I'm willing to study it, I'm willing to look at it further. I'm open-minded, of course, to science, but to use in the environment and supposed global warming. I read a journal the other day that said that we may be now going into a global cooling period, and we had a very severe winter in many parts of the country and other parts of the world as well, just this past winter, and some are predicting the same for this winter.
Okay.
So I'd love to study that a little bit more and get some more information on it, but just personally, Chris, I'm skeptical.
Okay. Mr. Nader?
No, I think it's here. You just have to look what's happening in Alaska, the Andes, the Antarctic, Greenland. It's clearly here. The temperatures are increasing at an accelerating rate. And just in the last decade, it has stunned global climate specialists and scientists. Whether it's due to human behavior, I think there's an overwhelming scientific consensus that greenhouse gases, which are increasing very rapidly from motor vehicles, from industries and other sources, are accelerating climate change in that respect. I think the key is to transform our country and world to renewable solar energy and geothermal, and while it's being done, to dramatically increase the technological efficiencies of heating, air conditioning, electric systems, and motor vehicles and other forms that are now burning fossil fuels that are creating so many of these greenhouse gases.
Let me ask about reproductive rights. You are pro-life, and certainly there is an epidemic of the use of abortions in America, many people sort of resorting to abortion as a form of birth control. But the question is, if you outlaw abortion, and you look at societies that have outlawed abortion, I covered, for instance, Romania under Ceausescu, the result where abortion was illegal to boost the population level. Isn't what you end up, it isn't that abortion goes away. Isn't it that the wealthy still provide abortions for their wives and girlfriends and mistresses, and the poor people die in a back room through unclean practices of abortion practices?
Well, Chris, we don't legalize murder because some people still commit murder in the back alleys. We don't legalize thievery because some people still steal in the middle of the night. We did not have legal abortion until 1973 in this country, as you know, with the Roe v. Wade decision. And by the way, this is something where I believe that our Republican friends really need to hang their head in disgrace. They control the entire federal government from 2000 to 2006. They gained that prominence largely by promising the pro-life / evangelical / conservative Christian people in this country that if they were elected to Washington, D.C., that they would do something to end Roe v. Wade and abortion on demand. That was a major part of their plank in 2000. And from 2000 to 2006, they controlled the entire federal government. When George W. Bush became president in January of 2001, over 1 million innocent unborn babies were being slaughtered in their mother's wombs every year in the United States. When President Bush leaves office in January 2009, there's still over 1 million innocent unborn babies that are being slaughtered in the wombs of their mothers. The Republican Party was completely derelict in their commitment to life.
Thank you. Mr. Nader?
Well, Nader Gonzalez's campaign does not believe the government has a coercive role here. It's too personal a decision. It's what Roscoe Pound once called beyond the effective limits of legal action. He was dean of Harvard Law School, and he used that phrase to deal with prohibition, that you're not going to be able to enforce prohibition because the violation and resistance to bans on drinking alcohol far transcend any ability of the law enforcement to affect it, quite apart from its policy merits. Romania was an example where women were forced to have children. China is an example where women were forced not to have children, both by government edict. And that is not something that government has a role. It's interesting, you're for government on this one, and I'm against government on this one. The other point is it does breed a overwhelming violation and resistance. Anything that deals with such a personal decision or anything that deals with addictive processes have to be dealt with education, with respect, with nurturing, and with an attempt to try to reduce the number of unplanned pregnancies, especially among teenage women. So that's the way it has to go in that process. It's not going to work with government either saying you must have children or you must not have children.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Nader, about the separation of church and state. Of course, a concept designed by Roger Williams, a Descendist Baptist in Rhode Island, and then incorporated into the American Constitution. What is your stance on separation of church and state? And do you look at America as a Christian nation?
I believe America has Christian roots. I think there's any question about that. Any honest historian has to recognize the roots of our country are deep in the Christian faith. There's no doubt about it. You are looking at a man, Chris, however, that believes that either we have religious liberty for everyone or we have religious liberty for no one. From the crown of my head to the sole of my feet, I believe in religious liberty for the people of this country. For example, you may be surprised to know that there are many in the LDS community out in Idaho and Utah and Nevada that are supporting Chuck Baldwin for president. And by the way, if you want to donate, Ralph, you can go to baldwin08.com and throw that out there. Many of them supporting us enthusiastically. I've been out there many days and received some tremendous support. Obviously, there are great differences in doctrine and theology between what I believe and many of the LDS people believe. But what we both believe is that we believe that in America we are free to worship God as we see fit, when, how, etc., or if we choose not to worship God at all. That is none of government's business.
Thank you. Mr. Nader?
Well, I believe obviously in separation of church and state, like I believe in separation of corporation and state, but the separation originally was designed to protect religious freedom, not to protect the state. And the erosions of that separation of church and state accelerated under George W. Bush with the faith-based initiatives, with the support, directly or indirectly, for tax dollars to parochial schools, along with charter schools. So it's being very much blurred, and I think we have to be very careful of that and restore it to its original constitutional purpose, which is to protect religious freedom and not engage in taxpayer-funded preferences according to denominations or different schools of religious thought, which is inevitably what occurs when the government starts handing out money, crossing that boundary.
And by the way, Ralph, you and I agree on that 100%. I was one of very few evangelicals, Chris, that stood up publicly and opposed G.W. Bush's faith-based initiative programs.
Great. Well, we're going to end with closing statements. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to make a closing statement, and maybe, Mr. Nader, you'd like to start.
Well, we are now on 45 states in the District of Columbia. I just finished my 50th state of campaigning. I believe if you run for president, you shouldn't play blue state, red state politics. You respect all the voters. Our positions for short, immediate improvement in the lives of the American people involve full medical insurance with free choice of doctor, cutting the huge, bloated, wasteful military budget and corporate subsidies, redirecting that money to stem the slide into deep recession by a public works program, schools, clinics, drinking water systems, public transit, bridges, the things that are in severe disrepair and weaken the quality of life in the community. These are good jobs that can't be exported to China. We need an elaboration and an aggressive crackdown on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse, which is tearing the heart and soul out of America, out of consumer dollars, out of Medicare dollars, out of the taxpayers' dollar, out of pension funds, and that's what that Wall Street collapse was all about, rupturing that trusteeship with the trillions of dollars they were entrusted with in order to enrich themselves. I believe in opening up the presidential debates. I believe in taxing that which society likes the least and dislikes the most before we tax human labor. That means we should tax first speculation on Wall Street, great revenue producer. We should tax the addictive industries more, the gambling industries more, the corporate criminals more, and the carbon tax and other taxes on pollution. We want to depress those, and they also produce large revenues which alleviate the tax burden on working Americans. We want to repeal the Taft-Hartley anti-union law and liberate workers so they can form their own trade unions or join existing trade unions without obstructions. We want to end ballot access obstructionism to third parties who provide the new ideas, who provide the frontiers for American politics, and regenerate the two-party system with the message, if the Republicans and Democrats don't shape up, they're going to have to ship out. All of these and many more are opposed by John McCain and Barack Obama, who have in one instance after another demonstrated that they are one corporate party with two heads wearing different makeup. We want people to support us with volunteers, with Get Out to Vote, and with financial contributions to votenader.org.
Thank you. Mr. Baldwin?
My running mate is Darrell Castle. He's a Vietnam veteran, a Marine Corps lieutenant that saw great combat action, a great American patriot. He and I are crisscrossing throughout this country, giving the message of constitutional government to the American people. We are unashamedly pro-life. We believe in the right of the people to keep and bear arms. We are the ticket that will make a commitment publicly and enthusiastically to secure our country's borders. It's our first priority after we obtain the White House. We believe very much that we must get out of these entangling alliances around the world, that we must stop the foreign aid, that we must not allow our troops to become global cops for the United Nations. I believe that NAFTA should be overturned. We've got to bring our jobs back to the United States of America. We've got to quit punishing our manufacturing plants and sending them and driving them to other countries like Mexico, China, and India. We are the party, we are the ticket that really truly does want to bring back the fundamental principles of constitutional government to these United States of America. And I've said this all around the country, and I'd like to say it again here tonight. When Chuck Baldwin becomes President of the United States, this new world order comes crashing down.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming tonight.
Only by a declaration of war can a president send troops to invade and occupy a foreign country.
I'm going to have to stop you right there. Thank you very much. Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Mr. Hedges, Mr. Baldwin, and thank the audience and C-SPAN and other television channels who are here tonight. The Constitution starts with "We the people" in its preamble. The word corporation does not exist in our Constitution. The words political party do not exist in our Constitution, and yet we're ruled by the concentration of ever larger multinational corporations and their political indentured servants in Washington and state capitals. Whenever there is a concentration of wealth and power in a society, the prospect of any kind of democratic processes and democratic produced results for the betterment of the people become very slim indeed. Justice Louis Brandeis said you can have the concentration of wealth in a few hands or you can have a democracy, but you cannot have both. Our country today is in deep trouble. 9 out of 10 Americans in a recent poll think America is in decline. 3 out of 4 Americans believe corporations have too much power over their lives. And 6 out of 10 believe both major parties are failing. We need a third political force, and we believe the Nader-Gonzalez campaign has majoritarian positions on full Medicare for all, with free choice of doctor and hospital and private delivery. We want living wage for 1 out of every 3 American workers make Walmart wages, 7, 8, 9, 10, under $11 an hour. We want to cut the bloated, wasteful military budget, remove taxpayer subsidies for corporations, such as that grotesque $700 billion bailout on Wall Street. And we want to provide more facilities for consumers, taxpayers, and voters to band together so they shift the power from the few, where it is now, to the many.
Thank you very much. The first question I'm going to ask both of you, both Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, two people who have traditionally been very wary of the two-party system, have each announced that they will vote for Barack Obama. And I'd like to read briefly why these writers, who have been fierce social critics, have taken this position, and ask you to respond to their argument. First, Howard Zinn said, "We have gone through an insufferable 8 years with the Bush administration, probably the worst administration in history. In this situation, we are desperate for a change. So even though Obama doesn't represent any fundamental change, he creates an opening for a possibility of change. That is why I am voting for."
The fact of the matter is that the American people today, I believe, recognize that the two major parties and the two-party system in general is broken. A recent Fox News survey suggested that nearly 50% of the American people would consider voting for a third-party candidate in 2008. I was in Michigan not too many weeks ago, and I understand that the same survey was taken there. And in that state that has become so depressed because of NAFTA and some of these other so-called free trade deals that have destroyed our jobs and our manufacturing in those industrial states, that same survey was taken, and there, from my understanding, 80% of the residents of Michigan said they'd be willing to consider voting for a third-party candidate in 2008. I think the mood of the people is ready for a third party. It's interesting to me, too, that over in Iraq, the last report I heard, our government was happily sponsoring as many as 20 or more political parties to get involved in the new political process in Iraq. And so we're doing that there, but then you come back to the United States of America, and I'm sorry, if you're not a Republican or Democrat, then you don't have a right to compete.
But what about the argument that you know, it's better to be practical, it's better to be a realist, it's better to pick the lesser of two evils? I mean, in your case, certainly the Republican Party, despite John McCain's past opposition to the pro-life movement, he claims to support it now. I mean, how would you respond to the lesser of two evils? Mr. Nader, maybe you want to begin.
Well, if you cast a least worst vote, without pulling the least worst candidate, John Kerry, say, or Barack Obama, in the direction of the 20 or so political constituencies, the Democratic Party, labor, women's rights, minorities, anti-poverty, environment, consumer, then you don't exert any pull at all, and the corporate interests are pulling on Obama and McCain 24/7. So it's a completely losing process, and that's why every 4 years both parties get worse. They get more corporate. Barack Obama is the first Democratic nominee to raise far more money, from corporate interests, Wall Street interests, and corporate attorneys than the Republican nominee, in this case John McCain. Why are these corporate interests investing in Barack Obama?
Let's let Mr. Baldwin take the last minute to answer that.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah. The lesser of two evils, as I tried to mention a minute ago, is I think one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in, that whole mantra. You know, let me just speak to the evangelicals for a minute. If they were a first century Christian and they had the opportunity to vote for Nero or Caligula, which one would they vote for? Would it be Nero because he would slaughter a few less people than Caligula? I mean, where do we go with this? The fact of the matter is, I would contend that the way that we have been treating these Republican candidates lately, the Republican administrations are actually more harmful.
For Obama, that is why I suggest to people that they vote for him, but I also suggest that Obama will not be faithful, will not fulfill that potential for change unless he is enveloped by a social movement which is angry enough, powerful enough, insistent enough that he fills his abstract phrases about change with some real content. Noam Chomsky said, talking about Senator McCain and Senator Obama, to say it doesn't make any difference who wins is to express your contempt for the general population, because it does make a difference. A lot of what they say is correct. The two parties are effectively factions of one party, the business party, But the factions are somewhat different, and over time the differences show up in benefits, working conditions, wages, things that really matter to people. So let's start with you, Mr. Nader. 90 seconds if you could respond to these statements by Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Zinn.
Well, first of all, we know that Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Zinn agree far more with the Nader-Gonzalez campaign, but they are demonstrating a tactical vote. The tactical vote for the least worst, namely Obama, should involve a moral imperative to make demands on Obama. So if he wins with a specific mandates, specific series of mandates. The problem with the liberal and progressive intelligentsia is that they don't make their vote hard to get, and they allow the least worst to ignore them and go more to the corporate side and try to get a little slice of the right-wing vote, which is exactly what Dukakis, Mondale, Gore, and Clinton and Kerry did. And it wasn't exactly a winning strategy, except for Clinton with the Perot situation. So I think, one, there needs to be a demands made on Obama, and people living in slam dunk states that are slam dunk McCain and Obama can cast a vote for their conscience, because that doesn't affect the least worst outcome. And finally, it's not who wins, it's how they win. Are they going to win without worrying about progressive forces? Because progressive forces have told them they can be taken for granted because the McCain alternative is too horrible to contemplate.
Mr. Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think this whole mantra of the wasted vote or the lesser two evils is what has brought us to this place. I'll tell you what a wasted vote is. A wasted vote is to vote for someone that you know in your heart will not be faithful to the principles and the values that you believe in, that you know will betray the things that are core to that which is central to our nation's success, and yet to ignore those central core issues and to vote for someone because they may happen to fit into that lesser of two evils category. A wasted vote in 2008 for my
Live now to a debate between third-party presidential candidates. You can see the candidates are on the stage there. Chuck Baldwin is the Constitution Party's nominee, and Ralph Nader is an independent. On your screen now is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges. He's the moderator. Live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
For 10 minutes, and then the final closing part of the debate will see each candidate issue or give us a 2-minute closing statement. I would like to thank independent presidential candidate Ralph Nader and Chuck Baldwin from the Constitution Party for agreeing to participate in this debate. Free and equal elections, you can see their website, freeandequalelections.org, that organized the debate. C-SPAN 2, proof that television in capable hands can promote democracy and the common good, and the staff of the Mayflower Hotel for providing us with this space in which to carry out the debate. So, Mr. Baldwin, why don't you start with your 2-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for showing up to this debate. Thank you, Ralph. It's great to be here on stage with you. I'm Chuck Baldwin. I'm the candidate for President of the United States on the Constitution Party ticket. The Constitution Party is the third largest political party in America in terms of voter registration, except for the two major parties, of course, the Republicans and Democrats. We are a party that believes very much in the Constitution of the United States. That's why we are named the Constitution Party. We believe that most of the ills that we face as a country today are because the two major parties and the candidates that represent them have failed to be faithful to the principles and tenets of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. We believe that the only way that we're going to restore the greatness of America, not to mention prosperity and freedom, is to restore constitutional government. When any office holder, president, senator, congressman, county commissioner, state legislator, takes the oath of office, they raise a hand to heaven, another hand placed on the Bible, and they promise to be faithful to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the promise they make to the American people. Unfortunately, for too long, the two major parties have ignored that oath and have violated the principles of the Constitution, and that is why we're in the mess that we're in for the most part. We believe in limited government according to the constraints of the Constitution. We are a 100% pro-life party. We believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. We are pro-Second Amendment. We believe in state sovereignty. We believe that we must secure our borders. As Ronald Reagan said, a nation without borders is not a nation. We believe that conservative friends out there that are watching tonight, I would counter by saying that a wasted vote in 2008 is a vote for John McCain, because I don't believe that John McCain can anymore win this election than Bob Dole could win the election that he fought with Bill Clinton. I really believe that if Christians and evangelicals and conservatives in 2008, if they want to waste a vote, they'll vote for John McCain. I believe if they want to cast a principled vote, a vote for someone that they know in their heart will be faithful to the principles and the values that they profess to believe, I believe that they must cast a vote for Chuck Baldwin and the Constitution Party in 2008. I just believe that this whole wasted vote mentality is something that is not consistent with the principles of our founding fathers.
Thank you.
And our American Republic.
Thank you. We will now have a 5-minute discussion, and you're certainly free to ask questions of each other. I think I would begin by asking whether it's realistic, given the climate of our country, to even mount a third-party challenge, given the innumerable obstacles placed in front of candidates by the two-party system. Do you want to begin, Mr. Nader?
Oh, of course it is. I mean, look at the Liberty Party in 1840, anti-slavery. Aren't we glad some voters spun off from the Whigs and the Democrats and didn't go least worst and voted for the Liberty Party? The same for Women's Suffrage Party. The same for the Labor and Farmer parties, the late 19th and early 20th century. All these small parties never won a national election, but they put on the public table the social justice movements first, before the two major parties decided to pick them up. And aren't we glad that that occurred? You see, if nature doesn't allow seeds to sprout, it can't regenerate itself. If business doesn't allow entrepreneurs to have a chance, it can't regenerate itself. But somehow we got a shared monopoly by the Republican Democratic parties, who for a variety of state ballot access obstacles can squeeze out or drain third-party or independent candidates. They keep them off the debates because they control the debate commission. It's a private company, the two major parties. And when that happens, you don't get polled, and if you don't get polled, you don't get any time on the national TV. So it's a catch-22 vicious circle that is a suppression of the First Amendment rights of candidates that are not two-party, major party candidates to engage in the electoral arena.
Let's get Mr. Baldwin.
Well, the Republican Party was a minor party in 1860, and of course, we don't hear too much from the Whigs these days.
1860.
So, what did I say?
1960.
1860, that's right. So obviously, we can see that parties evolve through time.